Department of Defense electronic warfare matters. Prior to his current role, Dr. Conley was a program manager at DARPA in the Strategic Technology Office, where he executed a variety of EW advances. He earned his doctorate at Purdue University and completed the Apex Senior Executive Program in March 2016. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Conley.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here. As I learned after I broke my back, hiding behind podiums doesn't work very well for me. But also yesterday, I was down at Dahlgren looking at their directed energy work. And so having been in the directed energy forum world, I've also learned that being a moving target is always safer than remaining stationary. So am I on and good or am I not loud? Third. Unintentionally. But I did. Yeah. Okay. Let's try that. Hopefully, audio coming through and sounds better. Okay. One final bit of check there. Good deal. So excellent. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here to brief today to talk about the state of electronic warfare broadly across the Department of Defense. I think it's a very timely opportunity to go ahead and do this. Full disclosure, I spend too much time on my evenings and my weekends reading. And so in that means that I tend to weave in the narrative of, hey, this is kind of how Boyd was thinking about problems, this is how Clausewitz was thinking about problems, into the problems that we face today. And so I would go ahead and make the assertion that everything about warfare is fundamentally dynamic and continuously changing. And that really resonates with kind of a Boyd view of our need to be agile and adaptive, that ability to respond to the unknown, to the things that changed. I would say, though, there's two types of change that typically show up. The first of which are the things that were revolutionary, that were unexpected, the things that we didn't foresee coming. And the second one is the ecosystem underneath our feet is continuously moving just a little bit. And what that means is we can have things like electronic warfare that we've been doing in the RF part of the spectrum basically since World War II. We've been doing passive things there since World War I. So at least 100 years of history in the RF part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And you're going, why are we talking about this now? We've been doing this for 100 years. Shouldn't we be on to something else that's new and different? I would say that underneath our feet, the ecosystem, though, is continuing to change. And that's really the reason for being here today and talking about electronic warfare. If you look at Clausewitz, he would make the assertion that everything in war is simple, but doing the simple things becomes incredibly challenging when you're actually in that fight. And so doing electronic warfare, I think, is kind of key to that ability to either paralyze the decision-making of an adversary by giving them so much information they can't possibly make a good decision, or by being able to go ahead and disintegrate them by severing the head of the snake, therefore distorting their ability to go ahead and execute command and control, execute a coherent picture of a conflict. So that's kind of a little bit of an intro. As a function of my time at DARPA working on things that hopefully would impact the fight in about 2 decades, I always like to pay attention to trends. I think if we pay attention to trend lines versus individual data points, we actually can understand what likely is going to happen in the future better than this absolute knowledge. Well, I have exquisite intel, I understand everything about this, but what's happening underneath? And so the next chart actually gets into one of these examples of a trend that is happening underneath the hood that I think is critically important for us to go ahead and understand. This is merely one trend. There's a lot of trends that are out there. And so the image is a little bit dark here, unfortunately, with the projector. But basically what you have is you have a surface-to-air missile down there, and you have some sort of blue aircraft which has to go ahead and penetrate into that defended airspace. You'll notice across the top that I point out that A2AD is basically a fight in the electromagnetic spectrum, anti-access area denial. That capability that our potential adversaries want to be able to project power by basically saying this is a no-go zone for us. This is somewhere that you can't go ahead and get to, and making those engagements happen longer and longer every year. The figure down there in the bottom right is data that I lifted from Wikipedia. And obviously sitting here at the distribution A level, that ability to very candidly say, this is representative. Are the exact values, don't get too hung up on them, but the trend line I think is what's really important. So it's about 5, maybe 6 decades of trend line that's on there. And from the SA2 to the 10 to the 20 to the 21, being a guy that got a PhD in engineering versus mathematics, I will claim that it's exactly 2 decades and it's exactly a factor of 2 for the increase in range. Give or take a decibel or so. And so with that in mind, I would basically assert that if we look out into 2030, there's going to be a 600 kilometer plus shooter, which is coming. Whether we have intel to support that is a different can of worms. Unclassified data that basically says, look, and materials get more energetic and people are going to go ahead and increase that range that they can go ahead and drive keep-out zones. I think the other reason, though, that people want to go ahead and do this, and really where the electromagnetic spectrum fits in with this, is you can't just lob something 600 kilometers and expect it to hit anything. You're going to have to guide it. You're going to have to, A, have really good data on where the threat's at. B, you're going to have to do a mid-course updates. You're going to need a comms link to go ahead and do that. And you're probably going to turn some sort of terminal seeker on or some other way of doing terminal guidance to make sure that you actually hit what it is you're attempting to aim at. So effectively, everything about forming an A2AD environment is about being able to access the spectrum, form a long-range air picture, sitting at an organization here today, right, with Mitchell, form that long-range air picture, go ahead and guide a surface-to-air missile so it's close enough such that when the seeker turns on, it's actually useful. Be that an optical guidance, be that an IR guidance, be that a, any other mechanism of doing that, you basically are talking about using the electromagnetic spectrum to go ahead and do that. The quotation across the bottom is General Wilson, I would say, basically saying the same thing. So this is a quotation that he made before he was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, but back when he was at Stratcom. And so effectively the top line says superiority in any of the domains, land, air, sea, space, and cyberspace, is effectively dependent upon our ability to control the electromagnetic spectrum. Words that everyone has kind of latched onto over the last, I'll say, roughly year-ish is the kind of concept of multi-domain battle. That ability of how are we going to fight as a joint force better than we historically have, how do we go ahead and network better, is really about that ability to network the other domains together. I'm going to wager that's going to happen over an RF data link. That data is going to be shared over the RF data link. We tend to not drag optical fibers and wire our aircraft into the actual internet, but it's going to be going in some way, shape, or form over a wireless link. So with that in mind, looking at General Wilson's quotation there, that ability to control the electromagnetic spectrum, to talk about superiority in what we are doing in that fight there, is effectively the domain of what we're doing with electronic warfare. That level of knowledge of how are we contesting the spectrum, how are we protecting it, how are we accessing it. The EWOs kind of become one of the key practitioners. Obviously, those coming from the J6 or the sixes of the world and that spectrum management side are equally interdependent in that to where the future goes ahead and is kind of at. So this is one particular example of an important trend line. A second one, which candidly I will admit I don't necessarily have a good way to understand exactly what we do with, but I think is critically important for us to understand. So we, the Department of Defense, spend $70 billion a year roughly on RDT&E. So research, development, test, and evaluation. That pays for our basic research programs. It pays for our development programs. It allows us to go ahead and build all of our new weapon systems, all of our new MDAP programs. 70 billion, we spend 100, maybe 110 in procurement, depending on exactly which year you go ahead and look at. Full disclosure, I did this a year ago with the budget data and haven't updated it since. The trend is more important than the specific number. I grabbed 10 major companies that go ahead and allow us, and I actually took both my cell phones out of my pocket so they won't ring. I'm wagering everyone else probably still has one, if not two devices sitting in your pocket. Grabbed a group of companies that play in that space, that make sure that you can go ahead and deliver from a cell tower to your hand that data. Just R&D, not revenue, but their R&D spending on the basis of what they put in their shareholder reports, $50 billion a year. We, the Department of Defense, spend $70 billion. That's every ship, airplane, submarine, comms link, satellite, everything else that we do, we spend 70. They spend 50 to make sure that the devices inside of all of our pockets can go ahead and send charts to make sure that everything is in the right place at the right time to go ahead and do. Allows us to stream a video online, allows us to go ahead and get traffic to make sure that we get here in a timely fashion. We spend so north of $5 billion a year in electronic warfare. They're spending 50 to basically make sure that all of our cell phones in our pockets are able to go ahead and do. So if you look back 4 or 5 decades, we, the Department of Defense, really led in advanced electronics, and we were able to go ahead and dominate in that space. It meant our fundamental technology investments turned into systems in the future that gave us very useful and substantial military advantages. At this point, candidly, we will be outpaced by the rate of innovation which occurs in the commercial world. It means we have to be very deliberate in how and where we choose to be innovative with our defense unique dollars to make sure we're not being redundant with that, but also how do we leverage those investments that are happening? How do we make sure that we have the processes in place that allow us to really make the best use of that capability to go ahead and be innovative? So this chart gets into kind of two, I'll say, specific examples there at much more of a tactical level. Obviously, ranges of surface-to-air missiles, countermeasure systems, our ability to go ahead and penetrate A2AD. We can do that kind of at the tactical or the operational level. What happens, though, if we bubble up and if we look more at the strategic level of warfare, how people are thinking about information, about that ability to degrade someone's information, degrade that flow, be that us, be that our allies, be that pacing competitors, how across the board are people going ahead and looking at that? And that's actually the next chart in the deck here. So kind of three major different focus areas going across the chart. The first of which I'll draw everyone's attention to is up there in the top left-hand corner. A report from CSBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Analyses, from a year and a half, 2 years ago now, on controlling the, winning the airwaves. There we go. Make sure I get the right word from the title. You guys have the advantage of looking at the charts versus me looking out. So the Winning the Airwaves report, a good example of kind of how our strategic level thinking about the electromagnetic spectrum is continuing to evolve. As you read through that, it isn't just, hey, we're doing this in electronic warfare, and that's the only important thing. It's really about what is happening across the electromagnetic spectrum. Brian and Marco so far as to call it a domain here. That's an interesting discussion that we're going ahead and continuing to have in the Department of Defense. But in that, what's happening with our communication systems, what's happening with our sensing, be that our ES, our electronic warfare support, be that our more intel-driven sensing, but we're doing a lot of sensing via the electromagnetic spectrum, be that our radars that are sensing out there in the electromagnetic spectrum. And lastly, what are we doing with our electronic warfare assets? What is our electronic attack, our ES, and our electronic protection doing to make sure that we are denying either the ability for a pacing competitor to flow information or degrade the information that they're looking at to paralyze them, prevent them from being able to go ahead and make a good decision. So with that in mind, I think we have an evolving strategic thought on our side. That narrative will weave through the remainder of the talk. Secondarily, if we look across the Atlantic and we look over on the NATO side, they, over the last decade or so, I would say, have done a substantial evolution in their doctrine. And so I would say that is equally important, equally critical to make sure that what we're doing in the electromagnetic spectrum is going to interfere, manipulate their worldview, what they're doing in the electromagnetic spectrum. If our doctrine and our view evolved and theirs did not, most likely in a high-end fight, we would choose to not use many of our high-end capabilities because it would interfere too much with their capabilities. That's really what the figure in the top right on this chart gets into. And I apologize for it being a little bit small and combine that with kind of the brightness of the room. So everybody tends to get focused on the fact that there are all these interesting looking airplanes that are flying through. There's radars down there on the ground. The part that I always pay attention to is either the lightning bolts or in this case the little blue lines that are connecting everything. At some point I think there would be a phenomenal talk that we the Department of Defense need to have, which will basically be entitled What's Behind the Lightning Bolt? It's really easy to draw OV1s and to show how everything is networked together and how all of this information is in theory going to go ahead and flow and be shared. But the reality is, A, if you don't take the right data, B, if you don't send the right data, C, if it doesn't get there at all, worse yet, well, doesn't get there in time, worse yet, doesn't get there at all, we have to make sure that all of those things are happening appropriately. So effectively, every time that someone says it's a system of systems approach for going ahead and solving that problem, they effectively are saying we want to use the electromagnetic spectrum. That's my translation of effectively what it means when someone says a system of system-based approach. But the reality is that we fight as a joint force. We fight disaggregated. That trend actually goes back to Vietnam, was kind of the beginning of the disaggregation of sensor versus shooter. If you look at the military history on the US side, fast forward about 5 decades, we effectively now do this, but it means that we have to make sure that the electromagnetic spectrum is there. So it's one thing to say, this is what we, the US, are attempting to go do, and this is how we would like to go out and execute the fight. If we don't pay attention to our pacing competitors, we probably aren't going to necessarily have that full worldview, though, of what are they trying to do to us. And so that's the bottom report there from RAND. My preferred way actually to brief this is from the bottom up because I think it flows better that way as I kind of grab the 2 different quotations. So I encourage everyone, the charts are distribution A. We can share them with everybody after the brief, email them out to folks. But their view of strategic deterrence, coming out of a RAND report from about 2 years ago, which is China's evolving thoughts on integrated strategic deterrence. They're talking about information dominance. I would actually say that information superiority at a local time and place of our choosing is something that probably on both sides we should be thinking about. They choose to use the word information dominance. If we say we want to dominate something and they say that they want to dominate something, it's highly unlikely that both of us can simultaneously achieve dominance. The reality is it's going to be something resembling superiority when we look at kind of how doctrinally we're approaching this. So I would advocate from our side we do better if we talk about superiority versus dominance. So I would say perhaps they didn't quite get that one right. But if you look at that, though, they basically say, what are the key components that allow them to go ahead and have that integrated strategic deterrent? If you read through the entire report, it basically says they view their nuclear forces as a component. Obviously, any country which has a nuclear capability is going to view that as part of their strategic deterrent capability. They back that up, though, with their conventional forces. I would say we went through a very similar kind of mental exercise in that as we realized that we had mutually assured destruction. And we didn't really want that to be the way, as we played through every war game, that it had to end. And therefore, we got into precision strike, into that capability using conventional forces, conventional munitions, to go ahead and achieve our strategic goals. China's a little bit unique here, though, because they also talk about these these key components of strategic deterrence, which is this informationalized warfare, this information fight that they want to have. They have 4 components to that: space, counterspace, cyber, and electronic warfare. And so they go ahead and they roll up those 4 components. Notice that electronic warfare was the final one I hit on, into being part of how they are thinking about achieving strategic deterrence. That ability to manipulate the information that someone would see in a fight with them is something that they feel very strongly about. If you actually go back to Sun Tzu, that's effectively, if you know your enemy and you know yourself, you never have to fear 1,000 battles. Probably the most commonly quoted line from Sun Tzu. But if you understand how someone thinks and you begin feeding them bad data, distorting that information, or severing that information from getting to where someone would like to move it to, it's incredibly hard to fight and win. So in this, I think at the strategic level, there's a lot of evolution which is also happening. So far I've been at a pretty high level talking about, be it strategy kind of at this very national strategy sort of levels, or talking about kind of these very tactical type of examples of surface-to-air missiles. What networks those things together is actually what we get into on the next chart. So the overall pyramid, everyone in the room is likely familiar with talking about the tactical, the operational, and the strategic level of warfare. If you read Lutwak, you will very quickly bump into the fact that he actually argues there's 2 different types of strategy. There's theater strategy and grand strategy. One is much more of a political level. The other is much more of a military level. It's incredibly interesting, probably not really the focus here today, though. The important part, in my opinion, out of what he talked about is how the technical level actually forms a foundation. Arguably, as you heard in my bio, I spent about 2 years at DARPA as a program manager. Candidly, one of the mistakes that I made in looking at my time at DARPA was I wanted to do a technical thing that would have a strategic outcome, ignoring the fact that it had to really transition and turn into something where the TTPs were fully fleshed out, fully integrated into operational planning to go ahead and have that strategic type of effect. As I look at it, and over the 1.5 years I've been in my current job, the US tech base that we have is absolutely phenomenal in what we are capable of doing. The amount of innovation that we have in that community is spectacular. How much of it, though, turns into what we go ahead and actually design into our systems that we actually design to field? How do we allow our operators to go ahead and be innovative and figure out the new TTPs that'll go ahead and get the best bang for the buck? How do we roll that into our O plans, make sure that we have the best operational level planning to make sure that we can go ahead and get there? How are we innovative there? That actually goes back to an Eisenhower quotation, I would argue, which is plans are worthless, planning is everything. That ability to go ahead, to be agile, to be adaptive, to be responsive on the basis of that which has happened in the fight around us. And so with that in mind, I would actually say, while a really simple figure with a pyramid, there's actually kind of 3 main different types of people that we need to make sure that we have inside of our defense industry, inside of our forces. We need people that go deep in particular areas. With a PhD in engineering, I will admit that I used to be one of those guys that had to go incredibly deep into particular areas. We have a lot of expertise in that, but we need to make sure that we maintain the funding associated with that level of expertise, that level of innovation that occurs when you go deep. You also need people that go horizontal. And so I would say, sitting at the Mitchell Institute, looking at the Air Force Weapons School and the WISINT, the Weapons School Integration Exercises that occur every time, that really is that horizontal integration piece. That ability to have operators of all different platforms, of all different systems coming together and figuring out how to horizontally integrate. It happens at the technical level, it happens at the operational level, obviously, also. But lastly, we need to think vertically across this overall figure. We need those that can go all the way down to that technical layer, grab something which is disruptive, that would end up impacting TTPs, the ways that we are used to fighting, impact our operational planning, grab the right things and go ahead and pull those vertically across this overall figure. So the right-hand side of the chart has 6 words, and I like to use my fingers to go ahead and describe this. I don't have 6 fingers on either hand, so I therefore have to use 2 hands to go ahead and do this. We, the Department of Defense, we have a lot of culture, we have a lot of organizations, we have a lot of processes, all of which are good. They have gotten us to where we are today. Simultaneously, we have a lot of policy, we have a lot of doctrine, we have a lot of strategies. I'm using 6 things here. There's obviously other words that one can put on the chart. We have a lot of people, we have a lot of manpower, right? We have a wide variety of other things. But these 6 actually are illustrative for a little bit of a different reason. And I would say the reason for saying why they're illustrative, these 3 are actually what make us comfortable every day when we go to work. We know the culture of our organization, we know our organization, we know where we sit, we know who we work for, we know who works for us, we know the processes that we are going to use to go ahead and get through that day. While I will not claim that policy, doctrine, or strategy change quickly, they are actually dynamic. And really what they're saying is, what is there that we're doing over on the policy, the doctrine, the strategy side, congressional language which comes in, for example, and what is there that we want to go ahead and change about our culture, our organization, or our process? A great quotation by Drucker is, the culture eats strategy for breakfast. I will admit that I ate neither strategy nor culture for breakfast this morning before coming over here, but that's his assertion. And so if you ignore how you got to the culture and the organization that you have, and you do a strategy which is agnostic of that, you can basically end up with something that is unimplementable. What it also means, though, is that people that are very forward-leaning tend to look at any strategy document and go, well, that's kind of nice, but you really should have gone to here. But very quickly, you can end up with strategy documents which are completely unimplementable inside the doctrine and push for more change than the culture of the organization or the processes can go ahead and can really absorb. And so with that in mind, if we think about the evolution of strategy, policy, doctrine in a more evolutionary approach, it means we can take steps where we know where we're trying to get to, but they're steps that go ahead and set us up on a certain path. I would advocate that our changes over here should really go ahead and follow what are those major trends that we think are important? What are those investment trends? What are those technology trends? What are those things that we have to make sure that we really pay attention to make sure we get there right? So speaking of strategy and getting more specific yet in terms of exactly what we're doing, the next chart is the electronic warfare strategy for the overall Department of Defense. And so the good thing is that we got our strategy released late last winter, early this spring. The vision statement across the top there is out there and now publicly known, which is good. I know over the months that we spent writing it, we spent in coordination of the document. It's really exciting when you're really close, but every now and again people decide they want to change individual words, and so getting out in front of the secretary is generally not a good idea. And so the good thing is we now have a version at the distribution A level of this that we can go ahead and brief, that we can talk to. So what you'll notice is agile, adaptive, integrated electronic warfare to offensively achieve EMS superiority. That EMS superiority trend from a couple charts back shows up in what we're trying to do across the range of military operations. Not every fight is a high-end fight. Not every fight is a coin fight. Not every fight is a CT fight. But we have to be able to span across the range of military operations, across the different phases of a conflict, to make sure that we have the right capabilities at the right time to be able to go ahead and do. The first word that anyone that really gets excited about materiel investments wants to generally talk about is, but I'm doing this program in cognitive electronic warfare. And why doesn't cognitive, for example, show up in this Department of Defense vision statement for where you're trying to get to? And so the reality is that we're not only talking about materiel solutions here, but we're talking about the organizations, we're talking about the manpower. If I was to go out and talk to an EWO, grab them by the shoulders and say, I want you to be cognitive, that's really insulting. Because the reality is they are cognitive already. What we want them to do is we want them to be more agile, capable of doing more different things. We want them to be adaptive, able to respond to changes in their environment faster. We want them to be better integrated with the overall joint force, with our allies that we want to be able to go ahead and fight with. I'm not going to go up to someone and say, I really want you to finally become this cognitive person. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so very deliberately we picked adjectives that apply both to organizations, to people, to materiel solutions across the board, as opposed to picking adjectives that applied really well only to materiel. There's a lot of problems in electronic warfare that we have to get after that candidly are not materiel, and we have to make sure that we're going out and we're solving those also. The goal statements over there across the bottom right-hand side of the chart are straight from the strategy. They're a little bit wordy in a forum like this to go ahead and read. You guys obviously can read them as well as I can. The first three will look pretty familiar. They effectively say man, train, and equip. Instead of really saying man, it says organize. It's really how do we get the right organizational structure that then gets populated under the Title X authorities of the services to make sure that we have the appropriate manpower to be able to go ahead and do. How do we train in the right and the relevant way? Thinking back to the second chart in the deck, basically making the assertion that that electromagnetic spectrum is critically important. How do we get there right? How do we train in that full-up, contested environment? How do we do that regularly enough? The materiel side is obviously critical for us to go ahead and get right. What are those capabilities, those systems of the future that we want to go ahead and do? Number 4, though, I want to dwell on for a minute, which is the partner piece. And so you'll notice that it says bolster partnerships with industry, academia, interagency, and allied partners. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not sure if the U.S. has ever actually gone into a war purely by ourselves. I'm pretty sure that we have always gone with an ally, with a partner, pretty much anywhere that we have ever been. And so with that in mind, I expect that trend would continue into the future. What that means is that our high-end capabilities of how we want to execute electronic warfare have to be compatible or at least shareable in some way, shape, or form with our allies, such that they don't turn around and go, what was that? Assume it was an adversary system, our shared adversary that we both are trying to fight, and turn around and begin trying to deny us. So broadly, we have to make sure that the document is shareable, it's releasable. We've gone ahead and done that with a lot of our foreign partners. Secondarily, though, is this industry, academia, and the interagency piece. And so as a joint force, we have to make sure that we can go ahead and we can fight as a joint force. But we also have to make sure that we have the tech base that's coming up to feed that materiel side, that we can actually go ahead and share the document. So very deliberately, the document is a distribution C, which means releasable to anyone in the US government and any of their contractors. And so what that means is anyone here today that's on a contract of any sort with the US government can go ahead and get a copy, deliberately not making it classified, which then means that you guys would have to move it from this classified contract to that classified contract when one ends. The implementation plan behind it will be written predominantly at the secret level. And the reason for that is it begins to get into specifics of where we think programs are going. That's obviously shareable with those with secret clearances, but to lay out that these are the exact technical specifications of our next generation of capability. Candidly, if we put that out at the unclassified level, would give anyone trying to keep pace with us too much of an advantage. So we're going to do that one at secret, make it a little bit harder for everyone to store, to access, to view. Right now, we're working through the implementation plan. It is a delicate dance in full disclosure to make sure that we get this right. The reason for calling it a delicate dance is it's way too easy to write documents which are prescriptive, that tell someone that I want it done exactly this way. And the problem is, if I say I want it done exactly this way, I stifle innovation of anyone else who picks up that document, has to read it, and has to go do. Simultaneously, if you write something that's too vague, that every investment suddenly is going ahead and satiating the desire of the department to get after solving a problem, then people will basically continue down the path that they were on before, and the 25 years of inattention that we have in electronic warfare will probably continue for another 25 years if we aren't prescriptive at all. And so with that in mind, there's a very fine balance. We're working to make sure we get that right, working to make sure that we're laying out the right goals that go ahead and get us to the next level. My hope is over the next 6 months or so in classified forums, I'm able to start sharing a lot more of the specifics of that. But candidly, we're working through the structure of the document and trying to make sure we get that balance right. Because otherwise we will end up with a strategy where the culture will eat the strategy. And I would prefer to not make that mistake that Drucker highlighted a couple decades ago. So with that in mind, we're working through this one. So we have a department-wide strategy. Obviously, the Secretary of Defense did not come down to my office and say, Bill, I really want you to go do that. So then the question is, who did? And the who did is the Electronic Warfare Executive Committee. And that's actually the next chart here in the deck, is a overall highlight of the Electronic Warfare Executive Committee. So the EWXCOM, as typically gets called, was formed a little over 2 years ago now. DepSecDef Work is the one who chartered it into existence on the basis of the recommendations of a Defense Science Board report. The Defense Science Board report was 21st century operations in a complex electromagnetic environment. Really talking about that at a much higher level, a much bigger picture, What is that complex warfighting that we need the capability to go ahead and do all the different things that are going to simultaneously be coming into play to kind of realize that vision of where we want to be in the future. If you go back to the CSBA report from earlier in the brief, many of the themes across that DSB report I think are pretty well represented inside of the publicly released CSBA report. So for those that can't see the full secret version, I think it's a pretty representative look. Things that we're doing with the EWXCOM, and I'm going to make sure I get this right, senior oversight coordination, budget and capability harmonization. That's basically a buzzword for the strategic portfolio reviews, the issue team process. As at the OSD level, we're working through the budget, and we spend about 4, maybe 5 months every year working through that. How do we make sure that we're making the joint force whole? But how do we make sure that we're not losing this, little couple $1 million investment, which ends up having a humongous impact on a multi-billion or trillion-dollar investment that's out there in the future? How do we make sure that we're balancing those things right, make sure that we're taking risk where it makes sense, but also make sure that we're getting all the right enablers in? We now have a forum that allows us to talk about those budget issues, which, while they may be small in dollars, make that overall system of systems warfighting approach much more whole. So I apologize for all the acronyms. There is no way to spell out all of these different titles across the chart. Being in a more Air Force-centric room, I'll go ahead and hit on those that are more Air Force-centric, and then you guys understand that obviously the other services have peers. So the two chairs, the first is the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, my boss. The other is the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Very deliberately, that allows us to span anything across the .mil PF that we would need to, be that a materiel piece, be that a doctrine piece, be that a requirements piece, be that an organizational piece. At the co-chair level, we basically have appropriate authorities that we can go ahead and span that. Inside of the Air Force, you have the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, now General Wilson, who has that seat, and then you have the Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, AQ. Currently, Darlene Costello, obviously, is the acting, we've had the administration changeover on that. The other services are represented equivalently. They're service vices, they're service acquisition executives. Undersecretary for Policy for Intel, we obviously have a substantial need for the right intel data. We have a need to talk about what are the policy changes, where do we want to accept risk in a wide variety of ways. We have to have the other undersecretaries there. Commander of Stratcom, Commander of Cybercom. As I hit earlier on kind of how China's thinking about integrated strategic deterrence, we inside of our unified command plan for a long time have had Stratcom as the advocate for electronic warfare. Very deliberately, that pushes EW into a more, how are we using this as part of our view of strategic deterrence sort of a conversation. Cyber, especially cyber delivered over the air, is obviously the seam that kind of happens then with the commander of Cybercom. The effect to someone on the receiving side could look very similar. We want to make sure that we're coordinating those type of effects, that we're synchronizing them appropriately, so we want that representation. Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. As we look to those future agile, adaptive, and integrated capabilities, how are we going to make sure we're testing those in a way to make sure that we determine effective and suitable? As they approve test and evaluation master plans, and we have progressively more adaptive systems, that every time you give them a unique input, they're going to give you a unique output. Does it now mean that we effectively have a test matrix that if we want to fully understand the system, will take an infinite number of resources in an infinite amount of time? Probably not the right approach. How do we go ahead and manage that risk in the light of everything else that is ongoing? The Chief Information Officer, CIO, basically controls the spectrum policy piece. That's near and dear to our hearts. How are we going to be allowed to go ahead and use our systems in the US for training? How do we have the necessary spectrum so we can go ahead and execute those training missions? We have CIO at the table. Director of CAPE really runs what are the department's investments over the next 5 years, so cost analysis, performance evaluation. And then the Director of DARPA for where are these long-term technology trends that are going to make sure that where the department is going with electronic warfare is aligned with the overall advanced research capabilities which are out there. So obviously the 4 stars, if you go into their office, their whiteboard is not exclusively covered in things that involve electronic warfare. It has a lot of other stuff on it as well. In my office, though, it's pretty much exclusively electronic warfare, and I'm very fortunate to be able to have the position that I am in. And so myself, and it has been Major General Stacy Clarity, who was just nominated last Friday for his 3rd star from the Joint Staff, J8. He was the Force Application Deputy Director. Just got nominated for his 3rd star, so he's moving over to the personnel and readiness side, likely here in the near future. With that in mind, Brigadier General Crum, who is the Deputy Director for Requirements, is picking up General Clarity's seat as he rolls out. And so with that in mind, the two of us at kind of the 1/2-star level end up co-chairing the Electronic Warfare Capabilities team. That's the GS-1506 working group where the rubber meets the road. For many of the people in this room, kind of as an Air Force-centric, AQ ends up with a representative there, as well as the A5RE. Colonel Polaro just retired as his backfill comes in. Obviously, he will assume that seat. The deputy in the A5RE, Greg Torba, is the one who is currently, I see heads nodding, that's always good for people, people knowing the folks that are involved. There's a lot of the things that we're doing, though, that we can go ahead and do at the 1- and 2-star level. There are things that require the 4-star visibility, and when we need that, we have the right size hammer. There's a lot of things that we can go ahead and take care of at the GS-1506 level. There are a lot of things we can take care of at the 1- and 2-star level. We, in my opinion, basically got to where we are in electronic warfare from 25 years of inattention. We will get out of it with 25 years of attention. And I don't think that's going to be 25 years of attention purely at the 4-star level, but that's going to be a lot of 06s that do each their little piece of that overall puzzle that culturally allows us to go ahead and rebuild and go ahead and get us back to where we really want to be with our electronic warfare capabilities. So the good thing is I only have one more chart, and that way save at least a few minutes for some questions. And so with that in mind, it's the overall discussion chart. So just to go ahead and kind of hit the top of the waves here, that domain superiority, be it land, air, sea, space, cyberspace, is effectively really predicated upon that ability to have superiority or control in the electromagnetic spectrum. That strategic thinking is continuing to evolve. I think it's evolving in a very healthy direction, but I think that fact is pretty well recognized at this point. That strategic thinking is showing up in what we're doing, it's showing up in what our allies are doing, it's showing up in what our pacing competitors are doing. I think this is one where the ecosystem underneath our feet, as we in theory live in the information age. I'm actually convinced with email I'm drowning in data, but we in theory do indeed live in the information age. So as we live in the information age and we look at how informationalized warfare continues to evolve, I think there's threads of that are showing up for all of us. 4 areas here, I was reluctant to call them challenges because they are things that we are doing, but it's areas that I think we have to make sure that we get appropriately light on top of to make sure that we go ahead and get right. The ecosystem of commercial underneath our feet. Our $70 billion versus their $50 billion that they're going ahead and spending to make sure that they can go ahead and put good cell phones in everyone's hands as 5G comes out here in about, 3 or 4 years for that technology. That pace of technical change that is happening underneath our feet, how do we harness that? How do we take our DOD unique things that we need to do as DOD unique things, but integrate them with these commercial practices which are simultaneously happening? How do we make sure that we get that right? How do we allow that to be a focus of innovation for us into the future and really harness that? Because if we stick to our kind of traditional processes, we probably won't get that as well as we could. But if we really allow everyone to be as innovative as they possibly can be, I think our basis of innovation in our country is phenomenal. Making use of that with this changing ecosystem is pretty darn important. Writing appropriate requirements is incredibly hard to do for electronic warfare systems. We have a little bit of the legacy of that ECCCM, that electronic countermeasure. Now it's a countermeasure. Well, now I'm counting your countermeasures, so I guess that's 3 Cs, and we just keep stacking those up. It tends to turn into this cat and mouse game, this back and forth, as opposed to where do we see offensive advantage that we can go ahead and grab and, frankly, grab and make really good use of. How do we get those investments right? It's easy to respond to someone else's move. It's much harder to go ahead and force an offensive advantage. How do we make sure we get those in the right place? So I think we have to be very deliberate in how we write those requirements, make sure that we really understand thinking not only deep in one particular area, horizontal integration, but also vertical integration to make sure we put our money in the right bets as we go ahead and do that. Our opportunity for training. As I said back on chart 2, the A2AD fight is effectively about the ability to have EMS superiority, that ability to control it, to understand what's happening. How do we make sure that we have enough training opportunities to really get that right? How do we contest the spectrum in the ways that we think our pacing competitors would? Make sure that we have a ready and prepared force for whatever contingency we have to go ahead and deal with. And lastly is testing. I hit this a little bit on the last chart, but as we look at systems which are much less deterministic than systems historically have been, how do we make sure that we have enough testing data that we have the appropriate level of confidence without going broke or candidly taking too long and fielding something as obsolete merely because we wanted to go ahead and, as best we could, span that overall testing capabilities. So I think we have a lot of areas that are going to take some work, but I think there is certainly some good news. The first of which is the signing of the Department of Defense EW strategy, I think is pretty darn important. getting that on paper, out the door, saying this is where we're actually trying to get to. We kind of know where we are. We're going that direction. Merely saying we're going in that direction now begins to give a unity of effort that otherwise is really hard. Otherwise, you tend to get Brownian motion and everybody just kind of goes bouncing in whichever direction they want. And so in closing, because I promised on the title of the brief, what is the state of electronic warfare in the Department of Defense? The first thing that I will offer is I think the trend is going in the right direction. As I look at what we did as we did last year's budget build, as we did 2 years ago budget build, I think things are trending in a very positive direction. Getting that turned into fully releasable numbers that can come out at the distribution A level, because the databases that we are pulling our information from are held A, higher in classification, but B, higher level of fidelity than we would generally release, figuring out how do we turn this into a releasable format. I'm willing to make that assertion. I now know that I have to get the data out to prove that to everyone in the room. So I know as I went through this brief, it doesn't necessarily hit on that. The second one, though, in that the trend is improving. I think if we look at how we are choosing to use the spectrum, how we are choosing to contest it in our large force exercises, I think there's a lot of things that are trending in the positive direction there too. In classified forums, I can get into a lot more specifics on that. I'm not going to declare success in any way, shape, or form. There's a lot of work that remains to be done. But that's the fun part about sitting in the Pentagon, is getting to continue to watch that change as it continues to occur. And so with that in mind, happy to take any questions everyone has.
Dr. Conley, with regard to...
And they may make you wait for the microphone, though.
Okay. Thanks.
Dr. Conley, with regard to working with allies, I am honored to work with NATO a lot. Who is the point of contact at NATO in this particularly electromagnetic spectrum?
Right. So there's so depending if you want to talk kind of the more materiel versus the more operational side, there's kind of two different ways that obviously splits. I'm not telling you anything you don't know there. On the materiel side, sitting inside of AT&L, I'm plugged into a couple different working groups that are going through and working what is the next generation of electronic warfare capabilities across the NATO force. Offline, I'm willing to offer a little more insight there than I am at the distribution A level.
Are they into the EMS concept?
The what, sorry? Or the
NATO, the allies.
Yeah.
They'll know what I'm talking about.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Thank you. So Sydney, I see your hand going up over there, but you have to wait for the microphone.
I'm loud.
Yeah. But the camcorder won't get you then.
Hi, Sydney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. You touched on multi-domain battle, which does appear to be getting traction with all four services at this point. And you mentioned both that and what it's designed to counter, A2AD, are the linkages among the domains have to be RF until someone comes with crystal balls. So talk about these two trends cross-pollinating. One is this multi-domain concept, and the other is this increasing emphasis on restoring EW. And not just restoring what we had, but actually coming up with a new way of using it, which perhaps is where multi-domain could come in handy as an overarching concept. How do those two things cross-pollinate?
Yep. So I think many things which happen inside the Department of Defense are, a lot of people see the same problem or the same kind of core systemic issues at about the same time, and we tend to take a diverse number of ways of going after a diverse set of problems at the same time. We tend to not focus one thing on only this one problem that we can pin down. It's only exactly this. So with that in mind, the EWXCOM multi-domain battle, where the world is evolving in that sense. So when I was out at PACOM, I was out in Hawaii and got to meet with all of the different components while I was out there about 6 months ago. Had a very good conversation with General Brown at USERPAC, talking and from his perspective, what is multi-domain battle, knowing that the Army has written a fair amount about this recently. With that in mind, his understanding of the need for the electromagnetic spectrum to realize multi-domain battle, I would say, is very apparent, making sure that we prepare our forces, we equip our forces appropriately to be able to realize that vision, I think, is there. So with that in mind, if we want to realize multi-domain battle, we're going to need reliable communications that allow us to get the necessary data that we really want through. So there's the data that we would like to have, and there's the data that we need to have. how do we make sure we get the data that we really need to have through, and the rest of the time we'll take all the data that we possibly could have. How do we go ahead and allow that sharing of sensor data across a joint force is obviously going to be critically important. And so I think that sensor data, making sure that sensor data can be trusted, fits into electronic protection, an area near and dear to the heart of the Electronic Warfare Executive Committee to me as well. And lastly, how do we go ahead and roll back that A2AD bubble and make it smaller? Sitting in an Air Force-centric forum, obviously low observable aircraft is one way of going ahead and doing that, removing as much of your signature as you possibly can. Alternatively, you can raise the noise floor. Basically has the same effect, it prevents detection. Alternatively, you can put in so much garbage data that someone can't sort it through it in time to figure out what's real and what isn't. So I think there's a wide variety of different approaches that are broadly part of that multi-domain battle, A2AD, and electronic warfare sort of pieces that are all simultaneously happening.
And you distinguish between raising the noise floor and feeding false data. Are you talking about, I guess, jamming versus spoofing, or?
So that's yes.
And nobody goes to prison.
Yep. I prefer not to, sir.
Yes. Hi, David Isby, Air International Magazine. These days, the recent highest profile investments, you have things like Compass Call recapitalization, the coming to the end of the EA-18 procurement. Now, these systems are going to be with us for a generation in one form or other. Aside from obvious things such as open architectures, how do we combine investment in these long-term systems with the need to be highly responsive and do things in the future we may not currently envision?
Right. So an excellent question. So the first of which that I will offer. So the Electronic Warfare Executive Committee, which is what I talked mostly about today, is kind of that thrust. The other hat that I wear is acquisition oversight. And so in that, it means that I'm very, very attached to overall all of the MDAP, the ACAT-1 programs that we have in the department. And so if you look at that currently, I believe we have 7 electronic warfare assigned MDAP programs that are either 1Cs or 1Ds. What you typically see when you look at the MDAP programs, pick on something like F-35. When the F-35 is initially delivered, it is delivered with a survivability suite and the necessary capabilities for what we think we need as we overall went through and procured the platform. Let us then fast forward, and I will give 2 different examples of dedicated electronic warfare MDAP programs, EPAWS and IDECM. So EPAWS is the upgraded survivability for the F-15, and IDECM is the upgraded survivability system for the FA-18. And with that in mind, what you see is when we did the original platform, we tend to say, okay, bring us enough survivability. We then tend to go back and we tend to revisit, be it the comms, be it the radar, be it the avionics, be it the survivability features associated with those platforms. And so my speculation is if we look at where we are today and we look at where we are going into the future, we will most likely see platforms that end up getting built with some basic capability, which is what we know we can have today that we know that we need as we do that initial platform procurement. But as we look into the future, they're the things that we tend to come back and do additional MDAP programs to go ahead and make sure that we have done the necessary upgrades to make sure that we get right. Sir.
Hi, John Turpak. Is this on? John Turpak, Air Force Magazine. Can you talk a little bit about the divvying up of penetrating electronic attack, stand-in versus standoff, the Air Force versus the Navy, and talk about that platform that we've heard about, the PEA. What's the analogy for that? Is that like an EF-111 that's stealthy, or should we be thinking about that in a different kind of way?
So this is one to Sydney's point to make sure that I don't get myself in trouble and end up in jail. So as I'm pretty sure everyone in the room is aware of, there are 2 substantial analyses, actually really 3 analyses of alternatives that are currently occurring. The first of which is the 2 different, I say NGAD, but NJAD, the replacement to the airplanes that are out there, kind of the strike fighter problem that we have to make sure that we have the right capabilities in 2030 and beyond. And then there is a joint airborne electronic attack, AOA, which is ongoing. Knowing that the analysis there is currently happening, and I'm supposed to get an update on that in about the next month, I will be able to give a much better answer to that in roughly a month than I could today, on the basis that, candidly, it's been a little while since I've gotten an adequately detailed update to be able to answer your question with enough specificity to make sure I'm giving useful data as opposed to just raising the noise floor and giving bad data. So if you come back, give me about a month, maybe 2, I think I can give you a much better answer than I could today, where I know I would be giving you dated information.
And about dividing the stand-in versus standoff?
Right. So the dividing versus dividing stand-in versus standoff. So you're hitting on an issue near and dear to my heart, and one that candidly I spend a lot of time thinking about, because we tend to like to decompose and assign things to, this is what this does and this is what this does. It allows us, as we build capabilities, as we build budgets, to very nicely definitize this is how we're going to use something. I will hypothesize that as we developed the original M16, nobody wrote a requirement to use it as a hammer, but instead they wrote requirements to use it as a rifle. And I will bet you it didn't make it more than a couple days before someone turned around and used it as a hammer, because they had something that they had to put something roughly round into something that didn't have the appropriate size round hole, and they therefore used it for a reason very different than what was intended. And so I would actually advocate, and this is my kind of personal 2 cents on this, is advocate that the more that we break away from the world of this is standoff, this is stand-in, you can't use your standoff thing in a stand-in way, and Lord forbid you ever use that stand-in tool in a standoff way, because that's my little area, my little stovepipe, and how dare you come into my cylinder of excellence. I think the more that we move away from that and we basically embrace the fact that the reality is we're going to do a complex laydown when the balloon goes up, and we have to make sure that we have the right things in the right way that balances risk overall across the force. So I would personally advocate that we actually move away from assigning this is a standoff and this is a stand-in, but instead we understand the capabilities of, be that maneuver, right, its ability to be mobile in the airspace, in the ground, wherever it may be, but also what is its capabilities in the RF spectrum, or the IR spectrum, whatever part of the electromagnetic spectrum we want it to go ahead and hit. And how do we make the best use of that? How do we allow adequately, I'll say, agile mission planning tools to make sure that we can understand what those capabilities are? And even if we haven't necessarily tested something exquisitely for some particular format, that if it's the right thing to do at that time as we build a no plan, we actually allow someone the flexibility to be able to use it in the way that makes sense. I think it's a risk acceptance, but it's actually a way that we can harness our innovation differently than we traditionally have. A little bit in the back. Because I think I saw your hand go up earlier.
Hi, I'm Helen Waters from the British Embassy. You spoke about how electronic magnetic capabilities need to be compatible with allies, so we don't end up kind of having a war with ourselves before the war even begins. How are you going about ensuring that you have a understanding of how capabilities will work together with allies to make sure that they are compatible and they deconflict or work together in the battle space?
So you're hitting on, so as we wrote the strategy, one of the questions is, how do you measure or define success? And there are some of them where it's relatively easy to say we succeeded because we did. And then there are other ones where it's incredibly hard to say with adequate confidence, this is exactly how we want to define success, and therefore we are declaring that we are good here. And so to your comment on how do we make sure that we have confidence with our allies that it's going to work. So one of the things I commonly hear in the hallways of the Pentagon is we move with the speed of trust. And the first of which is we actually have to trust each other with the necessary technical data on what the system was designed to do, B, what the system was programmed to do, C, how we went ahead and we trained our operators to do. And so we really have to make sure that we get across all of those different seams, that we have that right and necessary data being shared. There is a substantial desire typically to say, well, I have a need to know this, but you don't, because the more things that I know that you don't, information is power, therefore I become more powerful the more things that I know. The reality is, inside of our fight with the electromagnetic spectrum, inside of our EW capabilities, the more we can break down that belief, I think the better off we will be. So the first of which is candidly, we just have to more openly share what are the no-kidding capabilities. I would argue if you look at the red flags, for example, that we end up flying generally out at Nellis, and the ability of everyone to go ahead and bring their platforms and go ahead and actually have to fight as a coalition force over the Nevada range. I think that's a good step in that direction for how things currently work. I think on the technology development side, on the next-gen program kind of materiel side, that can't be well, when we showed up and the first time that we ever brought platform this with the new system, whatever it may be, was the first time that any of our allies saw it. That's probably not the right time to expose you guys to something that you weren't planning for or expecting. At higher security levels, there are some really great examples of lessons learned when people think they know what something does versus what it actually does. I don't think that's surprising to anyone, but some really good examples. So candidly, we have to trust, we have to accept that there will be risks that sometimes in the past we probably would have preferred not to have taken, that we in the future do have to take. I think there's actually some unique capabilities if we look at how we are doing things like F-35 and the reprogramming associated with that, where doing that in a much larger picture, thinking already about, okay, what is happening across all the different places in the US, for example, those are the ones I'm the most familiar with. How are we programming that? Therefore, how do we expect it to be used? But making sure that allies are right there at the table to make sure that we're really getting that right. It's not a problem only with F-35, but it's a problem overall across the force. I was in a review of a different program and said, hey, so you said you wanted this advanced capability, and then you simultaneously said that you were looking at doing these foreign military sales. Is this advanced capability going? And this was the first time, to my knowledge, on the OSD side that both of those were basically put in the same briefing. Is that conversation already happening? How are we going to, either from our side, are we willing to take that security risk? What does that look like as we go forward? Having those conversations early and often, I think, is a massive step in the right direction. After we start doing that better, I think we then will get to the next problem in that step, and we'll have to go after that one too. So I'm going to mix it up and go this way.
Morning, Otto Kreischer with Sea Power Magazine. There's a lot of concern, particularly from my side in the Navy and the Marine Corps, in the fact that if you're transmitting, you can be targeted, and if you can be targeted, you can be hit. So they're practicing back to Cold War days of MCON, operating in the field without transmission as much as possible. How does that fit into the new EW strategy?
Right. So I would say very well. So earlier I referenced kind of the history, I'll call it the history of electronic warfare. And I would say passive targeting going back to World War I is arguably the beginning of electronic warfare in the RF part of the spectrum. It was 3-4 decades later, as we got into World War II, that we had the active part show up in the RF. And so, as I said there initially, sometimes the changes are the things that we never saw coming, they're the revolutions in military affairs. Other times it's that ebb and flow of the changing ecosystem underneath our feet that brings something back to the forefront and to the surface. To your point, the number and diversity of sensors that are out there is truly spectacular. And with that in mind, sometimes having EMS superiority may mean turning everything off. And to your point, going into MCON. And so that awareness, that understanding of what your own platform is doing, as well as what an adversary is doing. That said, and so I guess sitting here, I can try to shoot my watch, right? 2 airplanes that are flying, neither of which is turning on its radar, is basically going to have a visual fight. And I'm going to assume to anyone engaged in air-to-air combat that waiting until you have visually closed on someone is probably not where that fight is going to go anytime soon. So I will assume that perhaps both, but certainly one person is going to choose to transmit in some way, shape, or form, understanding what information that gains you, why you need that information, but also what vulnerabilities you are revealing as you go ahead and do that is really kind of that superiority-based approach that I think I've advocated through the entire brief. So
Okay, I know there are a lot of questions, Bill. We've kind of come to the end of our time frame, but I believe that you'd be willing to hang around a little bit
Yep. Absolutely.
to catch some of those we weren't able to catch here at the end of our time period. But thank you all for coming today. I think, judging from the size of the audience and the intention, nobody fell asleep. So it's
That's because of the
held
good
their
coffee in the
attention.
back.
Now, at the very beginning, you mentioned that you're an avid reader, so we have a little gift of appreciation for you about a subject that perhaps you don't normally read about, but it's European air power, challenges and opportunities. And I'm sure EW plays a big part in all of this, too. So please join me in thanking Doctor for coming to be here.
Thank you.
And I just remind you all, our next Mitchell Institute event is next week, the 28th, at the Capitol, where we're going to unveil our latest study on remotely piloted aircraft. So I hope to see you all there. Thanks. Have a great day.